All right, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for being with us today. We're really looking forward to bringing this interesting program to you, and we're glad that there's so much enthusiasm in this topic. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of USJETAA's sponsors, partners, and grantors. In particular, I'd like to thank the funders who are directly supporting this webinar, the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, and Claire, the Japan Local Government Center. Without them, this webinar would not be possible. This webinar is being hosted by two different organizations, the US JET Program Alumni Association and Kokoro Care Packages. My name is Bahia Simons Lane, and I am the Executive Director of USJETAA. Since we have so many new names joining us today, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our organization and take a moment to introduce both of the host organizations. USJETAA is a national nonprofit organization that furthers US-Japan relations by supporting the network of JET alumni in the United States. For those of you who are not familiar with the JET program, it is a competitive employment opportunity that allows young professionals to live and work in Japan, all across Japan in cities, towns, and villages. Being a JET is an opportunity to work and represent the United States as a cultural ambassador in Japan. Most participants serve as assistant language teachers in public schools or private schools at K through 12 level. Some work as coordinators for international relations, doing interpretation and translation. I myself was a JET, as was co-founder of Kokoro Care Packages, Lillian Rowlett, who's here today, and our interpreter, Jim Patrick. So JETs are everywhere. USJETAA facilitates programs for JET alumni, the 19 US JET alumni associations, and current JETs. Tonight's event is one of our many webinars on Japanese culture, and we also have many webinars on professional development topics for JET alumni. You can learn more about our programs on our website, usjetaa.org. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, we also encourage you to donate so that we can continue to hold virtual events such as this one. Now, I'd like to invite Lillian to tell you a little bit about Kokoro Care Packages.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Bahia and USJETAA for organizing this and getting us all together, especially everyone who's viewing as well from so many different time zones and across so many different countries. We really appreciate you joining us today. As Bahia mentioned, I was an ALT on the JET program as well for 2 years in Kashiwazaki, Niigata, Ken. And I started Kokoro Care Packages just about 2 years ago with our co-founder, Aki Sugiyama, who is based in Tokyo. I'm here based in Los Angeles. The idea behind Kokoro Care Packages, it sort of started as an idea to share local foods. I'm sure a lot of the JET alumna out there really misses the food from Japan. And we really wanted to showcase really authentic, quality made food that's made locally in Japan. And so we curate care packages and we now ship to about 35 different countries worldwide. But a big part of what we do, aside from sort of sharing the foods themselves, is we want to promote an understanding of Japanese philosophies and traditions, as well as a big part is supporting the local farmers and the producers as well that we partner with throughout Japan. As we're going to go into a lot of detail today, there's a lot of changing in the landscape of Japanese agriculture, and we hope to be a big part of sort of supporting those local traditions and sharing them with people across the world. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you Bahia again for hosting.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Before we begin, I would like to just briefly go over our agenda. First, we're going to start with a presentation from Dr. Patricia Maclachlan on Japan's agricultural crisis and the government's response. Next, we will have a presentation from Dr. Kei Shimizu on Japanese farming during COVID and the Suga administration. And finally, we have a special guest, Shohei Takemura, the owner of Bamboo Village Farm, and we will have a short interview with him before we go into a Q&A. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Patty Maclachlan. Patricia Maclachlan is a professor of government and the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries America professor of Japanese studies at the University of Texas in Austin. We're very lucky that she has power tonight and was able to join us, because yesterday that was not the case, as I'm sure most of you are aware, Texas has been hit by an unprecedented winter storm. So we're hoping she can stick with us through, through the whole presentation. Dr. Maclachlan is a student of interest group politics and political economic reform in Japan, and her publications include Consumer Politics in Post-War Japan, The Institutional Boundaries of Citizen Activism, and The People's Post Office, The History and Politics of the Japanese Postal System, from 1871 to 2010. She's an author with our other guest, Kei Shimizu, of a forthcoming book from Cornell University Press on the reform of Japanese agricultural cooperatives. All right, Patty, please go ahead and share your screen.
All right. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for having me. I'm a great fan of the association, and it's a delight to be participating in the seminar on a topic that's close to my heart for obvious reasons. All right, as I try and get my screen share going. Here we are. Is this visible to everyone?
Looks good, Patty.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, let me start. So the purpose of my presentation is very simple. I would just like to emphasize some of the many challenges that are confronting Japan right now in its agricultural sector, as well as some of the important changes that Japan's government has been introducing in order to make Japan's farming more competitive. So it's a story of crisis and also of hope. And when I'm finished, I'm going to turn this over to my co-author, Kei Shimizu, who will be talking about Japan's agricultural policies under the Suga administration, particularly under COVID. Well, let me start by pointing out that until the late 1980s, Japanese farmers had it pretty good. They enjoyed high standards of living, particularly for rural economy, and compared to farmers in many other countries, enjoyed very high standards of living. And I think the roots of that good performance are very much rooted in the reforms of the occupation era, which really transformed the agricultural landscape. During that period, the parasitic landlord class, which I'm sure many are familiar with if you studied your history, was eliminated, and a whole swath of small-scale farm households was empowered and took over the basic tasks of farming. Now, the average farm size was very small, only 1 hectare, and this lasted for many, many years, and that amounts to about 2.5 acres. So farms have traditionally been very, very small, and agriculture dominated by the traditional farm household. Now, the results of these reforms were manyfold, and 2 of them really stand out to me. First of all, the reforms of agriculture really helped democratize the countryside, and they also helped catapult farmers into the middle class. The reforms also enabled the rise of a very important organization in Japan known as Japan Agricultural Cooperatives today. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as Nokyo. This is a nationwide network of agricultural cooperatives at the local level and their related service providers at the prefectural and national levels. Now, Nokyo has really dominated agricultural production for most of the late 20th century, and we're at the center of a food supply chain that looked something like this. Basically, in Japan, for most of the post-war era, food traveled from farm to table through a very simple route. Farmers would sell their raw product to the co-op, their local co-op, and most farmers, 70%, and that continues today, were rice farmers. There's no need to process it. They would simply grow the product and hand it over to their local co-op. And then the co-op would lightly process that material, that product, and pass it up the JA chain to distributors at higher levels. JA would then sell that product to wholesalers and distributors, and it would eventually wind up in corporate or the corporate users or the homes of ordinary households. It was a system that worked very well, and it benefited Japanese farmers to a significant degree. Now, there were other routes to market during this period, but this was by far the predominant way in which products from the farm were sold and wound up in the market. Now, post-war farmers really prospered under this system, but also as a result of very generous redistributive policies that were implemented by the Japanese government. And the reason they were implemented was the Japanese government from about 1960 was really intent on making sure that farmers didn't fall behind in terms of their household incomes as Japan embarked on rapid industrialization. So a number of policies were introduced during this period that helped the JA system, the food supply network, and especially farmers to prosper and navigate the new economy. And these are just a few examples. The government ensured that markets were closed for many products, and particularly for rice. The rice market remained closed until the mid-1990s. The government also guaranteed very, very high prices for rice. By the 1980s, the price of Japanese rice was 8 times that of world levels. Farmers paid low taxes. Basically, workers and white-collar workers within the cities were taxed at fairly high levels, and that enabled these redistributive policies to the countryside, including a policy of taxing farmers at very low levels, both income taxes and property taxes. Land ownership and hence farming was also limited through a series of regulations to the farm household, which means that the traditional farm household really had no corporate competitors. They were the only game in town, and they did a good job at what they did. The result of these generous policies on the part of the government was that by the early 1970s, Japanese farmers were starting to make more than their urban worker counterparts. Now, this system lasted for quite a long time, but by the late 1980s, the writing was on the wall that this system of protecting agriculture and high expenditures in the agricultural sector could no longer be maintained. And by 1990-91, when Japan experienced the bursting of its economic bubble, and into the early 90s, it was clear that Japan was in full-blown crisis. Now, there are many aspects to that crisis, but let me highlight just a few of the key developments during this period. The first problem had to do with the aging of the farm population. We all know that the Japanese population in general is one of the oldest in the world. The problem for farming is that Japanese farmers have been aging at a rate much more quickly than that of the general population. By 2018, the age of the average farmer was 68 years old, nearly 68 years old. It probably is 68 years old in 2021. And our educated guess is that this is the oldest average age for farmers in the industrialized world. Another problem that accompanies the aging of the farm population is the lack of farm successors. Now, as you can see from this chart, by 2015, there were 1.3 million farm households in Japan which produced food for commercial purposes. In other words, that were selling for sale or producing for sale in the market. But as you'll see from the last column, the percentage of households with successors on the horizon has been shrinking steadily through the 1990s, but particularly from 2000. More than 50% of Japanese farm households today lack a successor to take over the family farm. And Kay and I, wandering through all these farm areas within Japan and talking to farmers, co-op representatives, and other local stakeholders, one of the most striking takeaways from those experiences was the extent to which ordinary farmers viewed this successor crisis as the #1 challenge for the future of agriculture, as well as for themselves. Another major problem within the farm sector has been declining farm household incomes. The bursting of the bubble soon brought about a change in the way farm incomes compared to those of urban workers. And you'll see from this graph that by 1995, farm incomes had peaked and then began a rather precipitous decline. So farm incomes have been decreasing at a rate much faster than that of worker households. And I would add just one more economic indicator here that's very problematic to Japanese farmers, and that is the decline in domestic demand for Japanese food. Now, the decline in demand for rice has been halved, or the demand for rice rather has been halved from 1960 to today. And the demand for food more generally is also declining as Japan's population begins to rapidly age. As we know, the older you are, the less you eat. So the older the Japanese population gets, the lower the demand for food in general. Now, by the way, this declining household income issue and declining demand and also declining prices for food, including for rice, over time have contributed to that successor problem. Japanese farmers have trouble finding successors because young people know they can probably make a better living and an easier living off the farm. All of these problems have resulted in a number of other challenges for the agricultural sector. Japan is well known for having one of the lowest percentages of arable land. If memory serves, I think it's 3%. And yet broader and broader swaths of that land has been going literally to seed in a negative way. By 2010, the total area of abandoned farmland created as farmers retire without successors and literally leave that land to go back to the elements, the total area exceeds that of the greater metropolitan Tokyo area. And this is very troubling for those who view farmland as a valuable asset and of great public interest. Now, I just painted a story that's rather pessimistic sounding and very troubling. And of course, it's something that preoccupies farmers throughout Japan. But I do want to stress, and Kay and I are both pointing this out in our forthcoming book, that there's been a great deal of small-scale structural change over the years that have made farming a little more competitive. Now, the consensus that has been growing amongst farmers and other stakeholders, local government, national government, economists, politicians, is that Japan has to move more from a system in which farmers are helped through redistribution of Japanese total income to one in which structural reform takes center stage. And it's a very difficult process to undergo. It requires a great deal of adjustment for farmers, but structural reform is increasingly deemed important in order to make Japanese farmers more cost-effective, more competitive, more productive, more profitable, and more capable of responding both flexibly and creatively to changes in consumer demand, both domestic and international. So there have been a number of changes over the years that have contributed to a more competitive Japanese farm sector, although there's still a great deal left to be done. And here are just a couple of examples. In the late 20th century, there's been a great deal of deregulation within the farm sector, within the management of farmland, and in related sectors that support Japanese agriculture that have enabled farm enterprises to diversify. And also routes to market are beginning to diversify. JA is no longer the only game in town, and farmers are no longer simply farm households as a result of the changes to farmland ownership and transfer rights. For example, corporations, non-farm corporations like construction firms or food processing firms can now lease farmland and engage directly in agricultural production. So there's a lot of change amongst who gets to farm today. And economists feel that that is a good step in the direction of making farmers more competitive and able to navigate increasingly open and globalized markets. Now, the big changes have come under Prime Minister Abe in his second administration from 2015, when he elevated the structural reform of agricultural reform as a signature goal in his so-called third arrow of his reform agenda known as Abenomics. And he introduced, under his watch, a number of different changes, and I'm just going to note two of them. One of them is to that huge edifice that we know as Japan Agricultural Cooperatives in 2015. Now, while the reforms that were introduced fell far short of what the Abe government would have liked to achieve, nevertheless, as a result of the reforms that did carry the day, co-ops, local co-ops, and their farmer members now have far more freedom to respond creatively to market opportunities. And that's been widely viewed as a positive change. Other government incentives have enabled farmers to diversify more away from rice production. It's been a very difficult process in carrying that out, but it is generally felt that with declining demand within Japan for rice, it no longer makes sense that still 70% of farmers, a reduced farm population, of course, but 70% still produce rice to varying degrees. There's also been a big push to increase food exports on the assumption that demand for Japan's excellent food products abroad can help compensate for declining demand for food within Japan. And I think this is where Kokoro care packages fits right in. So to just wrap this up, I would like to give you a profile of two kinds of farmers that Kay and I have met over the course of our fieldwork. One very traditional in orientation, and another a little more forward-looking, progressive, innovative, more entrepreneurial. Let's use that term. On the one hand, we have the traditional rice farmer, and they are ubiquitous in areas like this, in the northern reaches of the famous Noto Peninsula in Ishikawa Prefecture. This is the famous Shiroyone Senmaida, a major tourist attraction in the area, gorgeous site of literally 1,000 terraced rice paddies. Now, in the past, these little paddies used to be farmed by a total of 20 part-time farm households that worked part-time on the land and then in factories and other ventures off the farm in between the rice production seasons. Today, only one farm household remains to till the soil and depends very heavily on both urban and rural volunteers in order to keep these rice farms functioning. And this is a story of the decline of workers to work the land, particularly in traditional rice farming areas, that we can see around the country. Now, close to the 1,000 terraced rice paddies is this wonderful village called Kanakura. And Kay, whom you can see pictured here, and I enjoyed a really wonderful day talking to the former mayor of Kanakura village, who is also a rice farmer, now well into his 70s by the time we met him. This former mayor told us stories about how the size of his farm or his village has steadily shrunk. The number of farm households has been cut in roughly half since the late 1990s. And it's a real struggle for farmers to actually make a decent living producing almost exclusively rice with some limited diversification. So this beautiful traditional land that seemed the epitome of a historically significant Japanese farm community was really on its, I would say, deathbed. In fact, I'm recalling now a conversation that Kay and I had in the car as we were leaving this area, and Kay turned to me and she said, I would give this village 5 to 10 years before it shutters completely. On the other hand, that same summer, Kay and I visited a Mr. Kimura Osamu in Mie Prefecture, not too far from Kyoto, who began, after leaving an administrative position in JA, a farm called Mokumoku Teizukuri Farm. And this place was something unlike anything we had ever seen. This was an extraordinary example of an entrepreneurial farmer who managed to transform his farm into an establishment that basically occupied a spot on every stage of the food supply chain, shall we call it. On the one hand, for starters, it produces all kinds of food: rice, mushrooms, vegetables, fruits, and livestock products. We also discovered that on site, it processes its own foods, including its pork and beef, but particularly pork. And you can buy that stuff on its on-site farmers market. And he also sells over the internet and its specialized shop under the banner of Mokumoku Teizukuri Farm in small shops in Tokyo and other urban areas. But that's not all. This farm has innovated to the point where it also has a petting zoo and a outdoor theater where we enjoyed a very entertaining show, watching pigs jump through hoops and full of children, school children on their school excursions. There are also educational opportunities for children of school age to learn about not only farming, but also environmental issues and even cooking. And then finally, there are these wonderful restaurants on site where we had barbecued pork at this place called Boo Boo Restaurant, which if you know your Japanese means oink oink restaurant. It was delicious, although a little disconcerting to this foreigner watching tomorrow night's dinner wandering around the tables outside. But it was a wonderful experience, and perhaps an unusual one in Japan. There aren't too many ventures like this. It is an extreme example, but it is an example that we think underscores really well how opportunities have opened up for Japanese farmers to do more than just produce food. They can now move down the supply chain and engage in processing and other innovative ventures in order to improve their farm income. And I should also note that Mr. Osamu has become a very significant player in the local community as a source of employment and a very respected businessman. So Japan is changing. It still faces crisis, but there are opportunities that are opening up that this particular farmer really epitomizes. So to conclude, let me just make two brief statements. And that is, first of all, Japan continues to face an existential set of challenges, both economic and demographic. Although somewhat alleviated, they remain very problematic and very much on the minds of not only farmers, but also policymakers. And second, I think this recent history of structural reform designed to make farming more productive and more profitable and more attentive to consumer demand, has been culminating in the kinds of innovation that we see epitomized by Moku Moku Teizukuri Farm. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Kei, and Kei is going to talk a little bit about Mr. Suga and things happening under COVID, major challenges under COVID. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Patty. That was really informative. I learned a lot. Before we get to Kei, I just would like to remind everybody that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. It should be at the bottom of your screen, and please go ahead and put those questions in there. Now, I'd like to introduce Kei Shimizu. Dr. Shimizu is a research assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh and a visiting scholar at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Japan. Her research addresses institutional design and their effects on economic governance, with a special interest in central-local relations, property rights, and the digital transformation. Her publications include Political Change in Japan, Electoral Behavior, Party Realignment, and the Koizumi Reforms, as well as articles in the Socioeconomic Review, Journal of East Asian Studies, Current History, and Social Science Japan Journal. As we mentioned, she is the author, along with Dr. Maclachlan, of a forthcoming book on agricultural cooperative reform. Now, Kei, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much to Bahia and all the organizers, and it's a great honor to participate in this event, and it's especially exciting to see a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience, and also to be on here with Mr. Takemura, a farmer from Japan. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes augmenting or adding to Patty's presentation, bringing us sort of up to date on what the current Suga administration is doing or not doing as far as agricultural reform is concerned, and also the effects of the current COVID pandemic on agriculture in Japan. So my first point is about Prime Minister Suga himself. As most of you know, he is a more recent prime minister who took over after Prime Minister Abe resigned towards the end of last year. And one of the most distinctive features about Prime Minister Suga is that he has his roots in rural Japan, in Akita Prefecture in northern Japan to be precise, and is himself the son of a strawberry farmer. And why is this so significant? the most significant part of this is that this is a rarity. His background is a rarity among recent leaders, prime ministers of Japan, who have tended to be well-connected, often second generation sons from a political family. Of course, Prime Minister Abe himself had many relatives who had even been prime minister before him, as well as other politicians. And so this is a very new situation, one that farmers and JA in particular have latched onto in hopes that Prime Minister Suga will have much concern for the quote unquote traditional farmer, those who have been farming in Japan in the traditional way, especially under JA, for a long time. But at the same time, there has been some backlash in the sense that Prime Minister Suga was a deputy soldier for former Prime Minister Abe for a long time. And when he ran for Prime Minister in August of last year, he ran on a platform of stability and more of what Prime Minister Abe had done for nearly 8 years of a very stable political leadership in Japan. And during the Abe administration, as Patty just mentioned, much of agricultural policy, in particular reform, came via the private sector, resulting in more market-oriented reforms, allowing greater corporate entry into agriculture, which in the past in Japan has been very difficult, and in particular, allowing corporations greater leeway in agricultural land ownership and incorporation. So this has been a point of concern that despite Prime Minister Suga's background in agriculture, that he ran on a platform of more of Abenomics, more of what Prime Minister Abe had pushed. So even though many farmers and even the traditional JA organization recognizes the need to diversify agriculture away from the traditional farmers, these new entrants have done little to help the plight of agriculture in most of rural Japan. And so JA and the more traditional farmers hope that Suga will not be just more of the same, that is more of Abe's policies, but that he will recognize the characteristics of not just the traditional farmer, but even of the JA co-op system to revitalize agriculture and rural communities both. My third point is about the Suga's policies so far. Unfortunately, agriculture has not been front and center on the Suga agenda for obvious reasons. Prime Minister Suga came into office in the middle of the current COVID pandemic. And so, of course, that has been front and center of his policy concerns. But that said, there has been a key area of support for increased agricultural exports. And to that end, trade deals with countries such as the UK, which has recently applied to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a multinational free trade partnership, has been greatly welcomed. But this area remains to be seen. Again, the COVID pandemic has taken up much of the bandwidth of the current administration, and agriculture has sort of been placed on the back burner for the time being. Now, segueing to the, making my way towards the COVID pandemic itself, and how that has affected agriculture in Japan. Unlike in the US, where farmers have had to even till their harvest back into the land due to backlogs in the distribution system and supply chains during the current pandemic, Japanese farmers have done relatively well during COVID. Supply chains have not been severed in a terrible way. That said, those who supply the very high-end produce have suffered considerably due to a downturn in the restaurant and hotel industries. This is probably true everywhere in the world. But this, at the same time, has also led to a bigger push to encourage farmers and even the JA to strengthen their marketing skills. via things like e-commerce and marketing online and straight from farm to table and other ways that bypass the restaurants and hotels and other travel industry related outlets that are now mostly shuttered. So of course, COVID in Japan has been relatively contained and cross-country comparisons perhaps are not very meaningful. But at the same time, the role of JA and farmers during COVID has been supported and quite effective. And with that, I'd just like to make one last comment on the pandemic, which is that Japan's agriculture, as Patty mentioned, has been suffering from a decline in the farming population, as well as aging of farmers. So the demographic shift among farmers has been quite significant in the last decade or two. And as a result, Japanese farmers have begun to rely heavily on foreign workers who come for officially as trainees on Japanese farms for a maximum of 8 years or so. But with the current pandemic, this influx of foreign workers has been completely severed for about a year. And this has led to a great panic among many farmers who had, over the years, come to depend heavily on these foreign workers. And what has this done to Japanese farming is that for those who can afford to do so, it has greatly accelerated the technological investment in agriculture. That is a kind of technology that can substitute for more farm hands. So this includes mechanization, automation, digitization. So with the sudden decrease in foreign workers on farms, technological solutions to the worker shortage problem are booming. But again, I note that this is only for those who are able to afford to do so. And that's not, of course, true of all farmers. So that's where we are at today. And I'd like to really hear from Mr. Takemura himself, who probably has a lot more to say about the current state of farming in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kay. That was really, really interesting. I think we're getting a more and more complete picture of how what things are like in agriculture in Japan. And I know with Takemura-san sharing his story, we will get an even more complete picture. Before we go to Takemura-san, I just wanted to briefly introduce him and his farm. Shohei Takemura was born in Machida City, Tokyo, which is where the Bamboo Village farm is located. After graduating from university, Takemura worked as a systems engineer for 3.5 years at a robot production company, and then as a ship engineer in Singapore for 2 years. After 2.5 years interning at farms and schools, he founded the Bamboo Village farm in September of 2014. He practices natural farming and mainly grows potatoes, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, taro, garlic, and onions. His farm now welcomes thousands of guests each year from around the world to experience farming firsthand. If you have a chance, we do encourage you to visit. All right, now I would like to invite Takemura-san, Lillian, and Jim to unmute yourselves and to turn on your video, and we will go ahead and get into this portion, this interview portion of the session. And this portion will include consecutive interpretation. Okay, Lillian, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bahia, and thank you so much for joining us, Takemura-san. Ohayo gozaimasu. I know that it's a very busy day for you, and it's early in the day for you, so we very much appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. I wanted to start off just by getting a little bit more of your background. I know that you made a big switch going from engineering to farming, so we wanted to have a little bit of an idea of what motivated you to make that change, and what were some of the positive surprises and challenges you've experienced.
竹村さん、お忙しい中、この会議に参加してくださってありがとうございます。で、まず竹村さんの、背景、その経歴について確認したいですが、エンジニアから農業へ、その変更されたきっかけは何でしょうか？その難しい点、良い点、教えてください。
皆さん、こんにちは。 僕自身が、もともとエンジニアというか、普通にサラリーマンやってて、そんで、農業に転換したものです。転換するときに僕の場合は、健康とか、食っていうことが、やっぱやりたくて、農業をやろうかなってなって、自分自身がアトピーを持ってたとかもありまして、で、周りの人たちにアトピーとか病気の軽減ができたら、農業やっててもいいと思って農業に参入しました。
Hello, everyone. Yes, I started out as an engineer, but basically I was a regular salaryman, and I decided to get into farming. Specifically, I was interested in health and food. And from that perspective, I then decided I wanted to get involved with farming. Some of the background to that is that I myself have eczema, and I was thinking about ways that we could reduce eczema in children and that health perspective.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I actually had the opportunity to visit Bamboo Village Farm when I was in Tokyo and literally got to have my hands in the dirt as we were helping out. Your farm has a very wonderful community feel to us. Can you tell us a little bit more about your farm?
私自身、前に東京出張の時、そのバンブービレッジファームに訪問することができましたが、コミュニティフィーリングが素晴らしかったと思いますが、もう少しそのバンブービレッジファームについて説明してくれませんか？
うち自身は自然農とか自然栽培とか、農法のことも結構きっちりはやってるんですけども、すごい人が来てくれるっていうところがすごいうちの特徴として、遠農とか、ボランティアみたいな形から見学とか、イベントみたいなのを回して、年間、2000人以上来てるっていう、新しく始めた新規就農者から見たら、ほとんどないような事例になってると思って、そこがすごい特徴かなと思っています。
Yes, we focus on all natural farming at the Bamboo Village Farm, but really one of the and we definitely focus on the all natural farming, the organic farming. But one of the great characteristics, one of the differences with my farm is the many number of people who come and visit us. We host various events. Some people just come for the day. Some people come to study. Every year we've had over 2,000 people come and visit the farm. So I think as a new entrant into the world of farming, that's a characteristic that really makes us distinct.
Yeah, I do have to reiterate, if you get the chance to visit Bamboo Village Farm, it's a wonderful opportunity to help farm. I actually got to plant some of my own piman or red peppers, so it was a great experience. With regards to natural farming, could you tell us a little bit more about some of the specific techniques that you choose to use or not use in your farming?
はい、繰り返しになりますが、ぜひとも皆さん、そのバンブービレッジファームに行ってください。私自身はピーマンの栽培にちょっとやってみました。少しその農法、その自然農法についてもう少し教えていただけませんか？やってること、やってないこと、お願いします。
僕の場合ですと、まずやってることというか、まず農薬とか化成肥料っていうのは使ってない。で、動物性堆肥っていうのも使ってない。で、肥料っていうのは、使わないっていう形か、植物性堆肥っていう米ぬかっていうものを使ってます。で、種に関しても、F1 シードっていうのを使ってなくて、固定種っていう昔ながらの種、半分ぐらいはそのうちの自家採取をしてたりっていう形をとってて、結構珍しいというか、そういう形をとっています。
Yes, so let me explain about some of our natural farming techniques. First of all, we don't use any pesticides. We don't use any agrochemicals. We also don't use any animal-based fertilizer. So we either don't use fertilizer at all or we use plant-based fertilizer. Also, in terms of the seeds of the plants that we use, we don't use so-called F1 seeds. We only use regular open pollination traditional seeds, and actually about half of those are seeds that we take ourselves, that we get from the plants ourselves. So I think that kind of farming, those farming methods are fairly rare in Japan.
Thank you so much for that. And in terms of natural farming, what would you say are some of the advantages and disadvantages?
自然農法ですが、その利点、その難しさについて少し教えてください。
まず難しい点っていうのは、やっぱりできるのが遅かったりとか、大きくなりにくかったりとか、病虫害にやられてしまうっていう点は絶対的に、簡単に言うと、経営ベースに乗っけるのがちょっと難しい点ですね。で、良い点っていうのは、負荷をかけにくいというか、環境にももちろんそうですし、あとは、野菜とかなんとかに、負荷をかけてないので、もし何かあった時もやっぱ強い。で、さっきコロナだけじゃなくて天候不順とかのこともあったと思うんですけど、根を深く伸ばしたりとかするので、そういう天候不順にも強かったりはします。
Yes. So first, some of the ways in which it's difficult. Just in terms of the farming methods we use, it makes it take longer. It makes our crops smaller, and also less resistance to disease and things like that. So from a business perspective, it can be challenging because of those reasons. But in terms of some of the positive aspects of it, well, first of all, we're not adding a lot to the farming process. It's not extra work in a lot of these ways. It's good for the environment, but it's also in a lot of ways, since we're doing these natural things, it makes it safer in terms of the weather and those kind of difficulties.
Thank you. And as a natural farmer that supplies most of the produce to your local community, do you choose to work with any of the co-ops that were mentioned previously? And if so, why or why not?
作物を自分の自治体に出していると思いますが、先ほど話がありましたように、生協や農協と関係がありますか？取引ありますか？
基本的に僕の場合は JA や農協っていうとことやり取りっていうのはなく、個人とか、知り合いというか施設だったりとか、マルシェっていう形でほとんど直接販売をしているっていう形をとっています。
Yes, basically, or rather no, basically we don't really have a relationship with co-ops or with Japan Agriculture or anything like that. Most of our sales are to individuals. So sometimes they're friends and acquaintances. We work with some local facilities. We deal with farmers markets and things like that. But again, the majority of our sales are direct sales to individuals.
And then as we've talked about a lot about the aging population in Japan, how do you personally view the future of farming, particularly as we discuss the aging population amongst farmers?
先ほど日本の農家の高齢化の話がありましたが、竹村さん自身はその高齢化の中で日本の農業の将来に関してどう考えていらっしゃるでしょうか？
まず日本の高齢化っていうのは間違いなくこれは進んでいるんですけども、それと同時に若い人たちも入ったりとか、企業の参入はやりやすくなってきてるっていうのもあって、ちゃんと新陳代謝とかその次につながる動きになっていければ、そんなに農業だけがというふうな感じはしなく、僕みたいな子たちっていうのもやっぱいっぱい出てきているので、そんなに言うほどではないような気はします。それと同時に、やっぱり厳しい産業の一つではあります。
Yes, first let me say that obviously these trends, the aging population issue in Japan is happening, is a real issue. But it's also means that if it comes to mean that there's a good sort of if it leads to good metabolism in Japanese society, where it makes it easier for young people to join companies and start companies, I hope that this can lead to a good connection, a good cycle, if you will. And that's true of not just farming, but it's also true of farming. Like, take a look at my example, where I think perhaps with this there'll be a lot of opportunities for people like me. And so from that perspective, I don't think the aging population in Japan is as bad as you might, the issues coming from it are going to be necessarily as bad as you might hear. But that said, this is a tough business.
Thank you. That's really insightful to hear someone on the ground sort of giving some more color on the aging population. And then when we talk about the government, how do you find that the government is supporting farmers, and are there any changes that you would like to see them make?
はい、高齢化について話してくれてありがとうございます。そして、日本の農業、農家への支援についてですが、どう思いますか？特に期待している改革とかありますか？どう思いますか？
政府っていう関しては、すごい支援はしていただいているっていうのが現状で、それと同時に、補助金、政府の支援っていう形の取るのがうまい人たちっていうのが生き残りやすいっていうのも現状です。なので、なんか頑張っているというか、やってる人たち、やってる会社に支援を厚くして、そうでもない人たちっていうのには、やっぱ支援を薄くするっていう形の方が僕は合ってるのかなっていうのが思っています。
I can say that there is huge support and subsidies for farmers in Japan from the government currently. And also currently you see that certain farmers and certain companies are very good at getting the subsidies from the government currently. So I do think that if we could have a system where the supports went to the people who were working really hard, that would be good.
Thank you. And I just have one last question. Given the environment that we're in, how has COVID impacted you?
ありがとうございます。コロナウイルスの影響はいかがでしょうか？
僕のところっていうのは、都市っていうのもあって、ほぼほぼ影響がないっていう形なんですけども、地方の人たちっていうのは、大きな取引、学食とか、社員食堂とかみたいなところをやってた人たちっていうのは、軒並み結構出し先をなくなっている状態です。で、逆に東京とかっていうの場合は、行き先の一つとして、農地に来るっていうこともあって、うちはすごい人も増えたりとかしてありがたい。そんな感じです。
Yes, thank you. So we are in the city, but there's not that much impact directly on us, on our farm. There are some farms that provide food to schools and company cafeterias and things like that, and with shutdowns they might be affected. But more than anything for us, since we are in Tokyo, it's made us happy because a lot of people now from Tokyo can come and visit our farm during coronavirus.
Thank you so much. And we'll turn it over to you, Bahia.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to invite everybody, all the speakers, to please go ahead and turn on your cameras, and we will go ahead and start with the Q&A portion. First, I want to say thank you so much, Takemura-san, for being with us today and telling us all about your farm. We've got some great questions that have come in, and I think we'll have a chance for each of you to answer a few of those questions. So before we get into the Q&A, the first question I'd like to ask came up in the chat, but I was wondering if maybe this is a good question for Kay or Patty. If you could explain a little bit more about how co-ops work in Japan and what is unique or distinctive about JA in particular.
Let me give that one a shot. Japanese co-ops are a little unusual in that they're multifunctional. If you look at agricultural co-ops in just about any other country with a few exceptions, most agricultural co-ops perform one set of tasks. There are marketing co-ops, or they supply inputs for the farm, or they are providers of capital for farms. They're credit associations. In Japan, every co-op performs all of those functions: inputs, marketing, credit. They also provide insurance and a number of other services that supply not only farms, but also the broader community. So their multifunctionality is really unusual. And another major, I think, distinctive feature of the co-op system is the fact that for many decades, the co-ops were basically administrative arms of the Japanese government. Their pre-war predecessors were tasked to engage in the distribution of scarce food and to help carry out rationing. And their control over the rice supply continued well beyond the Second World War. In fact, it didn't really stop until the 1990s. So the co-ops, as both a multifunctional organization and also an arm of government agricultural policy, has made them enormously powerful. And as a result, they tend to have a foothold, at least traditionally, in virtually every agricultural community in Japan. Whereas in, say, the United States or Canada, co-ops tend to be very regional in orientation, and their geographic reach and functionality is also very limited. Kay might want to add a couple more things to that, but to my mind, those are the two really key differences. One other thing, a co-op is meant to represent a farmer in a market that doesn't necessarily prove helpful to the farmer. Farmers on their own are not very powerful. They don't have negotiating power. And when they come up against major processing firms or retail firms, the buyers of their products, they can really be taken advantage of. So the role of the co-op is to achieve strength in numbers by collecting the produce of all of these farmers and negotiating on behalf of the farmers and representing the farmer in the market. So the farmer in a system where there are major strong co-ops might actually be better off over the long term because the co-op is designed to overcome weaknesses that of the market that don't benefit farmers.
I might just add a couple of things to that, Patty. I think one of the unique things about JA, which is the name of the co-op in Japan, is that, first of all, from our own research, we know that there is, despite it being ubiquitous and everywhere in Japan, that there are great differences between local JA chapters, some that are much more market oriented and even pushing their produce to be products to be exported overseas, and those that are much more conservative and not as market oriented. So that's the diversity even among JA local co-ops in Japan is one. And then the other is that there's almost no such thing as a farmer who doesn't belong to a JA. In fact, I'm be curious to know if Takemura-san himself belongs to JA. And that's because there's almost no disadvantage to belonging to a JA, that the fees are very, very low. And if only for information about the community, it benefits farmers to belong to a JA. So I think those are two things that make JA also relatively unique among agricultural co-ops worldwide.
So Takemura-san, are you a member of JA? I think you said in your interview that you were not, but could you talk a little bit more about that?
Takemura-san、JA に入ってますか？
一応副会員みたいな感じでは入ってるんですけど、基本的にやり取りはほとんどないです。
I'm sort of like a semi-member, but I don't really have any interaction with them.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I'd like to also go back to something from Takemura-san's interview about incentives to encourage, farming. Takemura-san, you said that it seems like sometimes the farmers are really good at getting the subsidies and incentives, and that is a negative thing. Are there any positives about these incentives that the government is offering? And does it encourage family members to continue the family farming business?
その、竹村さんは、先ほど、その援助金についてちょっとネガティブに話したと思いますが、ポジティブな面もありますか？例えば継続者問題解決するには、何か援助金について何かコメントがありますか？ポジティブなところがありますか？
ポジティブな面といったら、やっぱりその最初の段階もそうですし、継続して、入っているっていうことに関して、本当にすごいできる人以外でも、できるかできないかわからない、その次の人たちっていうのにも、やっぱりチャンスがあるというか、で、設備投資してやれるっていうこともそうですし、その、新規参入の時のハードルを下げるっていうこともそうですし、やっぱ、あっていい面もすごいあるとは思います。やっぱその最初、スタートの時に、ものすごい投資が必要っていう産業でもあるので、その辺っていうのは、ハードルを下げてあげるっていうのは、ものすごい必要だと思います。
Yes, I do think that there are positive aspects to the system of subsidies and support as well. A lot of it has to do with initial startup costs and also, like you were talking about, successor costs. Really, a lot of these subsidies certainly allow people who can farm to do it, but even whether you can do farming or not do farming, it provides you with a chance to get involved. It also helps with investing in equipment for farming, and it really, these kind of subsidies help lower the hurdles to new market entrants. So there are good aspects there as well. I mean, to repeat myself a little bit, when you first get started in farming, it really does, this is an industry which does require a lot of upfront investment. And, in as much as this helps lower the barriers to new entrants, I think it's necessary, and it does have good aspects.
Thank you. Kay, it looked like you might have a comment or two about subsidies.
I didn't raise my hand or anything like that, but I think it's certainly true that these subsidies have both positive and negative aspects of it. And what I suspect are more of the negative aspects is that it does make some people it changes incentives so that people chase after these subsidies rather than do what's best for either themselves or for productivity or for market purposes. And part of it is, for example, Japan's long-held policy of reducing the amount of land that can be cultivated with rice, primarily to keep rice prices high. And this really, for a long time, helped part-time farmers who all they did was farm rice. And as a result, they were able to sell regular rice for a very high price, as high relative, especially to rice grown outside of Japan. And so this really skews incentives to for more market-oriented farmers who would have planted more rice, for example, for export, or with different different grades of rice, for example, to differentiate themselves from other rice. And of course, rice is the main product, the staple product of Japan. And so this greatly skewed incentives for a very long time. The government supposedly has done away with these subsidies, but other subsidies have kind of taken their place. And we won't get into it too deeply here, but the problems do persist.
Patty?
I would just add to that, and as Kay, I discovered when we were doing our research, learned firsthand while doing our research, one of the big challenges of the farm population is that part-time farmers still outnumber full-time farmers by a significant margin. It used to be 5 to 1, 5 part-timers to 1 full-time farmer. It's now a little over, maybe about 2.5 to 1. So it's improving. But in order for farming to become more productive, and efficient and more profitable, there should be more full-time farmers. They should be a much larger share of the farm population. And some of these rice subsidies that Kay just mentioned, again, they're quite complex. We can't go into great detail, but for example, efforts to dismantle some of the old rice subsidies were met with such a strong push of opposition from JA and other stakeholders that the government turned around and introduced new subsidies to produce feed rice, which is really, that's rice for livestock. And that's really much easier to produce than other kinds of rice for human consumption. And the effect of that has been to incentivize part-time farmers to stay on the land and not sell their land. So these subsidies are really complex and they can really skew market incentives and feed inefficiencies.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. All right, well, let's change topics a little bit. What role has climate change played in Japanese agriculture? Has the government recognized changing weather patterns as a challenge that the farmers face? And if so, have they done anything in response to support farmers? And anyone is welcome to take this one.
I mean, I think Takemura-san is probably most able to answer this directly from the producer's perspective. But what, as most of you know, Japan is very widespread north-south, right? It's an island archipelago sort of spread north-south. And so the one thing that climate change has really done is changed where primary products are grown. So it used to be unheard of that rice is grown in Hokkaido. Well, now rice is grown in Hokkaido because it's a lot warmer there than it used to be. On the other hand, other parts of Japan now have to change their primary product because weather is much warmer or more extreme. And the other thing, of course, is that the extreme weather patterns of more typhoons or less snow in the winter, these things have greatly changed how farmers have to deal with what used to be very set weather patterns. And so it would be hard to say that the government has really kept up with these changes, but farmers have certainly struggled to adapt to these changes, especially because the investment in various things, especially rice paddies, are so very high.
I know from a little bit of research that I've done as well that the governments have sort of looked at putting in better infrastructure in order to sort of mitigate the impact, because I think that there has been a lot more rainfall that's causing issues with a lot of the overflow from the rivers as well. And so that there is an idea that they need to put some safety measures in to combat the effects that we're seeing from climate change.
Takemura-san, do you have anything to say about the role that climate change has played in Japanese agriculture?
竹村さん、どう思いますか？地球温暖化、気候変動に関してどう思いますか？
やっぱり、観光と農薬使ってる人たちとかっていうのは、例えば雨が長く続いちゃうと農薬が効かないとか、肥料が流れてしまうとかっていうことが多々あるので、結構きつくなってくるとは思います。で、僕みたいな人たちっていうのは、例えば根っこの話をさせてもらうんですけど、根っこが例えば2倍伸びると、縦横深さって言ったら8倍の土とか肥料とかを掴むことができるっていう風になるので、実はあんまそこまで影響がないっていうのも事実です。
そう、根っことおっしゃったんですか？
根っこですね、ルート。
Okay. Yes. So, for example, if you have a lot of rain in traditional modern agriculture, if it rains a lot, it can lead to issues where you lose the fertilizer you've put down or the pesticides you've put in place are diluted and don't work as well. So I can see how climate change could be tough for some farmers, but frankly, for us, it's less of an impact. We have a lot of root vegetables. And, if we can respond to it more, if the root grows more, we can put more on there. We can respond more flexibly to that.
Thank you. Our next question, comment and question. I know the government encouraged donations to food banks in Japan, especially during COVID. Could you discuss agriculture and its relationship to food banks during this time? And I think I don't know, Kay, maybe you're the best person to answer that one.
So certainly, one of the things that has been happening in society in general, even before COVID, is that inequalities, and especially the increase in those of lower income in Japan, has increased over time. And so food banks have begun to play a major role in sustaining those who have a harder time coming by 3 square meals a day. So this really predates COVID. But under COVID, of course, this has become even more severe, especially those who've lost part-time jobs in hospitality industries during the pandemic. But I must say, I have yet to hear about any direct relationship between farmers and food banks. Often food banks are concentrated in urban areas with high population densities. In rural areas, I would guess that it's not as big of an issue, first and foremost, because food is much easier to come by in rural areas. It's a lot cheaper in rural areas. And there are more stronger community networks in rural areas still, despite the erosion of the past few decades. But I personally don't know of any, I'm sorry, I don't know of any direct relationship between farms and food banks. Perhaps Takemura-san has heard something along those lines.
Takemura-san, do you know of any connection between farming and food banks during the COVID time?
竹村さん、そのコロナ禍の中で農家とフードバンクの関係、その共同取り組みなど何か聞いたことありますか？
まずコロナ関係なしに日本っていうのはあんまり寄付文化がないんですよね。だからそのアメリカとか、他の国と違って寄付をするという文化がまずない。まずこれジムさん訳してもらって。
Well, first let me say that regardless of the coronavirus pandemic, Japan doesn't quite have a culture of charity like that. Like you see in the United States, we don't quite have the same culture of giving or culture of charity that you see in the United States and other places.
そして、コロナ前もコロナ後も、例えば畑で野菜って半分くらい捨てられている、これも事実なんですよね。
So also, regardless of coronavirus, both before coronavirus and I'm sure after coronavirus, in reality in Japan, about half of, say, the vegetables grown in a plot of land might be thrown away.
でフードバンクの話だけじゃないんですけど、多分その消費者と生産者がもうちょい歩み寄ってもらって、ちゃんと農家さんがちゃんと、した職業になるようになれば、フードバンクとかに寄付もできますし、その今、やっぱうちとかでも来るのは、農家が全然、例えばサラリーマンの年収の半分以下とかなのに、野菜あるから寄付してくれっていうのはやっぱ来ちゃったりするんですよね。そこら辺はやっぱりきついんですよね、やっぱ。でも僕は、子ども食堂とかに寄付してます。
So yes, so I do think, I don't know if it's a food bank or not, but I do think we have a situation where we could do more if the producers and the consumers in Japan were closer together. We might be able to do more. But I can also say that if we're talking about a farmer who has perhaps half the salary of a salaryman, asking them to give away free food might make them a little angry. But that said, I try and give food. I do provide food to some facilities for children and things like that.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot more questions, so we'll do our best to get through them. Our next question is, recently I've seen articles discussing an increased interest in organic produce over this last year as a result of the pandemic in the US. Has there been any noticeable increase in Japan over the past year in regards to interest or sales of organic produce specifically? And maybe that's another one for Takemura-san.
I think just before we get into that question, I think when we talk about organics, it's really interesting to note that the term organic can mean different things in the US than it does in Japan. And specifically within Japan, it's very, very hard to get that organic JAS certification. It takes a lot more paperwork and there's a lot more rules and regulations that you have to go through. So I think sometimes when we talk about organic food, there are foods that are farmed and made in Japan that would probably meet the organic standard in the US, even though they don't actually carry that actual seal.
Thank you. That's an important point for clarification. So Takemura-san, have you noticed any increase in Japanese interest of organic produce over the past year?
竹村さんどうですか？過去1年間、その自然栽培、オーガニックに対する、社会には興味が高くなっていると思いますか？
基本的には高くなっているとは思います。ただ、日本で言われているのは大体 1% ぐらいしか有機農家はまずいないと言われてて、そのうちの面積ベースだと 0.5% ぐらいっていうのなんで、ほぼほぼいないっていうのが現状なので、意識が高くなっているイコール流通するとは違いますし、意識が高くなっているイコールうちの野菜が全部売れてるとも違うんですよね。だからやっぱゆっくりというか、アメリカと違って多分ミドル層が多すぎるんですよね。だからオーガニックとかジャンクフードというよりは、その中間層が多すぎて、なんか食べたいけどあんまよくわかんないって人が多すぎるので、増えてはいるんですけど、やっぱちょっとずつって感じですね。
つまりミドル層はジャンクフードではなくて、オーガニックではなくて、その真ん中の食品に対して満足されている方が多いということですか？
そうですね、そういうことですね。
So I do think that awareness or attention paid to organic food is increasing, but frankly, it's still not very much at all. If we look at it, there are different ways to look at this. By some accounts, organic food only makes up 1% of the Japanese market. If you look at it in terms of cultivated land, it's 0.5% of cultivated land is organic. So in other words, it's not much at all right now, currently in Japan. And just because there is an increased awareness of organic food in Japan, doesn't necessarily mean that it's selling well or that it's popular, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm selling all my vegetables. So I think it will take time. I think it's a slow process. I think perhaps another issue we have is that there's perhaps different from the United States. I think there's a large group in the middle of Japan, like not just the ones that want, like if you have the people who want organic food and the people who are happy with junk food, I think there's a very satisfied larger middle class of food consumers in Japan that might be a hurdle to this.
Thank you. I have one more question for Takemura-san. What is the average length of stay for a visitor farmer who comes to your farm to learn and practice farming?
竹村さんね、もう一つの質問ですが、訪問者が多いと思いますが、平均滞在期間はどのぐらいですか？その、バンブービレッジファームの訪問者。
1日のですね。
So usually one day.
来る人たちはもう朝9時とかから夕方7時とかまで、もう10時間とか平気でいますし、もう見学とかだけの人たち言ったら、数時間、2、3時間とかの人たちもいっぱいいますね。平均したらどうかな ?5、6時間ぐらいかな。
で、それ1日、例えば週ベースで。
1日、そんで、来る人たちっていうのはもう毎週来るんですよ。毎週来るっていうのが多分10人ぐらいとかいて、もう本当に、これイメージの話なんですけど、朝ジムに行って、ご飯を食べて、夜買い物をするみたいなのが、うちでは農作業をしてご飯を食べて、野菜を買って帰るっていう形の人たちが、もうその人たちが多いというか、うち的には助かっているって感じですね。
それは10人程度ですね。
10人程度だけど、毎週やったら500人とか、1000人近く行く。延べ2000人なので。
はい。 So different ways to look at this. You know, there are some people who, you know, if they're volunteering all day, they might come from 9 o'clock in the morning and stay until it gets dark. So I don't know, maybe 10 hours. There are other people, if they're just coming there for research or coming there on a school trip or something, that may only stay for 2 or 3 hours. I don't know what the average is, maybe 6 or 7 hours. But then I was trying to dig a little deeper, and there are some people that there are maybe a dozen people who will come in every single week. But some people will also just fit it in as part of their day. You know, they'll get up in the morning, they'll go to the gym, they'll have breakfast, they'll swing by my farm, help out, buy some vegetables to take home. So there's lots of different ways people visit.
Yeah, it's a really easy trip from Tokyo. It's about an hour and a half from the center. And as I said, it's a very inviting atmosphere. And so, as you mentioned, you know, you can come by, help out for an afternoon, or come by, help for a full day, and sort of pop in and out. And so it has a very strong community aspect to it.
Thank you. All right, our next question. What are some of the challenges and opportunities for structural reform in the government itself related to food and farming? This attendee says, I've heard a little about the push for digitalization under Ministers Kono and Hirai, but should MAF's role in Japanese food and agricultural shift in specific ways other than restructuring subsidies?
That strikes me as a multi-part question, and let me just say a few words about the first part. Traditionally, it's been hard to introduce agricultural reforms in Japan designed to make agriculture more competitive, more entrepreneurial, more like a business. And that has to do in part with the politics of agricultural reform. And for decades in the post-war era, there was a very strong farm lobby that consisted of JA leaders backed by farmers and conservative members of the LDP from rural areas, and also anti-reformist voices within the Ministry of Agriculture. And those three groups together really had a major say over what kinds of reforms could be introduced. And they served as a brake on any kind of liberalization, opening markets, reducing prices, reducing subsidies, etc. It is as a result of that, reforms have always been slow. Kay and I always say there are no big bangs in Japanese agriculture. Things happen at a glacial pace and it's incremental. But from the 1990s, there have been some electoral reforms that have weakened the power of this lobby, particularly the power of the organized vote of farmers. Farmers represented several, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of votes, and they traditionally would vote for the maintenance of the status quo. But they're shrinking in numbers, and they're becoming more diverse. Their interests are more diverse. So that old lobby is breaking down, and there's more opportunity now, I think, that as Abe highlighted, for the government to introduce reforms that we might disparagingly call neoliberal, more market openings and more competition. But nevertheless, those kinds of reforms have gained a foothold because of the changes in the political landscape. Kay, I think, might have things to add to that.
I think I heard something about digital ministry or digital reform somewhere in
That's
that
a multi-part
question towards the beginning.
Yeah.
And so I did comment on that a little bit about how technology has begun to play a bigger role on some farms that could really afford that kind of investment. Part of the goal of creating a digital ministry is to really try to get away from the silos of different ministerial powers that have existed in Japanese bureaucracy over decades, meaning that the Ministry of Agriculture used to have, monopoly over agricultural issues and would not allow, for example, other ministries that may have regulatory power over technology to enter into the farming sector. And so that, in that sense, that it breaks down the barriers to having things like new digital technology enter the farming sector, that's a good sign. Again, it's not for every farmer, and the upfront investment is even higher than just farming itself. And so to the extent that the government could help in that, in those investments, and to help overcome some of the worker labor shortages that farming is suffering in Japan, that I think would be a big assistance to the industry as a whole, and also a way to get Japanese agriculture much more productive and efficient.
Thank you. Are there factors working against the consolidation of farmland and the introduction of more large-scale industrial farming methods, despite the fact that so much land is reportedly going fallow?
Yes.
Yeah.
In part of the post-war reform effort was to empower the small-scale farmer, and the occupation reforms were followed up with legislation that basically entrenched those reforms in law and made it virtually impossible for anything but a farm household, a traditional farm household, to own farmland and till the land. So it was called owner farmism, owner cultivatorism. And it's been culturally significant, politically significant, as well as the legal law of the land, to center the farm in these individuals. And as a result of other changes, it's been very hard for farmers to buy land from each other, to lease land in particular to one another. In fact, leasing became very, very difficult until just quite recently, the last decade or so. And so these barriers made land consolidation very difficult to achieve. For decades, the average farm size was just one hectare. There have been very small incremental changes to the agricultural land law, and the biggest one came in 2009, when the government at the time decided that non-farm corporations could actually lease land and engage in production directly. And that has made land consolidation in practice more easy to achieve, much easier to achieve. So even though farms the plots of land within a particular farm may be owned by different farmers, it's managed and farmed now by larger enterprises as a result of some of these changes to farmland transfer and leasing rights. But farmland consolidation is one of the biggest goals of the Abe administration. The aim was to consolidate 80% of land within larger scale farmers by the year 2023. That's not going to happen, but that's been the goal for some time.
I should add to that it's also important to keep in mind that much of the land that lies fallow is in the more mountainous and less ideal agricultural land areas of Japan. So we hear about these rural communities that are depopulating and land is lying fallow. That is usually really in the mountainous areas. And if you have any agriculturally fertile area that's flat and easy to farm, it's not as if you find land lying fallow there. So I think it's important to note that yes, there is depopulation, and yes, there is a problem of land abandonment. But also remember Japan's history of having opened up a lot of mountainous areas during the post-war years, especially in order to try to increase food production when there was a rice shortage. And in some people's views, some of this mountainous land should go back to being mountain. It should never have become rice paddies in the first place. And why should the government spend a lot of money trying to consolidate this land and keeping it rice paddies? So there's multiple views on this and where that effort should go.
Thank you so much. So we got a lot of really good questions, but unfortunately it is 9:32 p.m. Eastern time, and that means we are out of time. I would like to conclude, however, with a final question for Takemura-san. Being an essential part of the ecosystem, how do you see the future of agriculture in Japan?
つまり竹村さん、エコシステム、その生態の中心になる 農家の役割どう思いますか？つまり農家と環境の関係についてどう思いますか？
農業っていうのはやっぱり環境を保全するっていう意味もあったりはすると思うんですけど、現状は多分そこを評価してくれてる人っていうのは少ないっていうのがありますし、評価対象が頑張ってっていう言葉の応援だけだったりする。例えば現実に手伝いに来るとか、購入して下支えするとかではないので、ありがたいはありがたいですけど、そこじゃ多分、僕らは動けないというか、農家さんっていうのは、頑張りきれないと思うんですよね。だからその辺とかのシステムを、簡単に言ったら地主さんとか政府、行政を動かさなかったら、僕らはやっぱ難しいっていうのが現状です。
つまり農家が、環境に優しい農法を入れるために、やはり政府の力、社会のサポートが必要ということですか？
そうですね。歩み寄りというか、やっぱり消費者が言ってこっちがいいだろうっていうのが多すぎて、でも政府、行政とか地主さんはそれを望んでないことが多々あるっていう感じですね。
So I do think farming plays an important role in maintaining and conserving the environment, though I don't know that many people would praise us for that or recognize us for that currently. I think it feels often that a lot of people want to, tell us to gambaru, tell us to do our best, and in the sense of environmentally friendly farming, but I think they don't necessarily want to help. So I do think that there needs to be support for environmentally friendly farming.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much, Takemura-san, Shimizu, Patty Maclachlan, Lillian, Rowlett, and Jim. Thank you so much for your interpretation. We really appreciate you being with us on this this webinar today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of our attendees did as well. For those of you in the audience, I have dropped a few links in the chat, including information about the host organizations, USJETAA and Kokoro Care packages, as well as the link to Bamboo Village Farms blog and Facebook page. I believe they're both in Japanese, as well as a link to our post-event review survey. So we'd love to hear from you about what you liked about this event, what went well, what we can improve for future. So please do take that survey, and we will also email out the survey afterwards. So look for that in your inboxes. All right, thank you all. Have a really wonderful evening, or for those of you in Japan, a great rest of your day. And thank you very much. Good night and goodbye.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.